Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Today, as part of our forum presentation from the Episcopal Church of the Holy Communion, we are catching up with our partners in Central America. For about 4 years now, Holy Communion has been partnering with the nonprofit human rights advocacy organization Cristosal. We've set a couple of delegations down to be part of seminars in El Salvador around questions of human rights, to get to know some local advocates and look at ways in which we can bring human rights work back to North America, back to Missouri. Normally, we alternate years. Normally, we would be bringing a group from Cristosal, or at least a couple of folks from Cristosal, to Missouri right now. And of course, we can't do that. And so I'm really grateful to both Noah and Osvaldo, and I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit, for joining me in this virtual way. But if I could ask you both to introduce yourselves, and as you do so, talk about the work of Cristosal and the sort of general, what is the organization about? So if I could start with Noah, and then we'll go to you, Osvaldo.
Yeah, Mike, thanks for the invitation. It's good to be virtually connected to the community and up there. I'm Noah Bullock. I'm the executive director of Cristosal. And so for those of you who are hearing about us for the first time, we're a human rights organization with a presence in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. We are mandated to accompany and support victims of violence and human rights violations. And in the context of the pandemic and the recent events going down in the world, we also understand our mandate is oriented towards defending democracy. The counter trends of increasing authoritarianism, because we know that authoritarian governments do not feel accountable necessarily to the citizens, and much less so to their most vulnerable groups. There's a direct connection between authoritarian governance, human rights violations within their borders, and world history shows us the authoritarian governments, autocrats, don't respect people within their borders, much less respect norms or standards outside of their borders. And sooner or later, they generate greater instability in the world. So we see ourselves working focused on victims, people immediately affected by violence, by human rights violations, but we see ourselves as interconnected with the events and things that are happening even up in the United States, as democracy is holding on tooth and nail in some of our communities.
We'll get into that a little bit more, but I'm always impressed with how much, when we have a group that engages with Cristosal, whether that's in person or whether that's through online learning, how much they come back and say, these are things that we're facing. We just don't name them the same way in the United States. So we're going to come back to that question. Osvaldo, you're one of the newer members at Cristosal, and I wonder if you could give us a little bit of your background.
I'm Osvaldo Lapuente, and I work in Cristosal, Guatemala, and I have a long international career in Central America since 2000, from the very beginning of the new century. So it's a pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity.
2 years ago, when we had Noah and David Morales, the leading human rights attorney that Cristosal has in El Salvador, we talked a lot about the Mozote case, which is this emblematic case around human rights and around sort of both what is the state of how is Central American governments going to interact with human rights historically and going into the future. And I know there's been some developments in the Mozote case in recent days, and I'm wondering if between the two of you could catch us up a little bit about what's going on with El Mozote, and maybe give us a snapshot for those who are hearing about it for the first time of what's going on, what Mozote is.
Just a quick background. Cristosal, we are a non-governmental human rights organization, but in El Salvador, when the Attorney General's office is unwilling or incapable to prosecute crimes, non-state organizations or legal representatives can represent victims in penal trials. And so Cristosal is currently representing the victims of the largest massacre committed on the American continent in modern times, which is the El Mozote massacre. Over 1,000 people were slaughtered. The majority were children by a complicated military operation involving soldiers who were trained and armed by the United States. So it's a big case. It's the largest homicide case, like I said, in the modern times on our continent, and it just so happens that Cristosal's team of 4 lawyers is prosecuting it, which is kind of a strange. There's like a disbalance in the magnitudes, right? Like the the magnitude of the crime and the resources that we bring to justice. But that is the reality that we're trying to change. So after 40 years of impunity, we have an opportunity now to prosecute the military high command at that time in El Salvador, which was also the military junta that was controlling the country. Over 20 officers, many of them generals, who are now on trial for the first war crime ever prosecuted in a national court. And we are at the very end of like a discovery phase where we're bringing the evidence forward. And in that, we asked for the judge to order the Minister of Defense to open the military archives so that we can have access to the war plans that would demonstrate responsibility structure for the slaughter. And this has been a demand that's been made since the signing of the peace accords. There's a Supreme Court ruling that orders him to do this. And now there's a specific judge investigating murder, torture, forced disappearance, among other crimes, to open the archives. And we brought in experts actually from Guatemala, military archival experts. We flew them in. And on Monday morning, these inspections were going to start. And it was if you see the videos online, it's kind of striking. You see a judge walking in just his suit with 4 or 5 of his colleagues up to the military high command, which is like a fort, and they're stopped at the gate, and a colonel is waiting for them. It informs them that they will not have access to the military archives because of national security risks. And so that was a historic moment because nobody has ever had access to the military archives, much less a legal team representing the victims of war crimes perpetrated by the military at the highest levels. And you have a blatant act of obstruction of justice being committed in this historic moment by the Minister of Defense and under orders of the President of El Salvador. And so one of the things that's important about El Mozote, and I know I'm only supposed to talk for 2-minute segments, but El Mozote is a crime of such magnitude that we understand that there are the victims, obviously, whose families were slaughtered and homes were burned, have an interest in justice. But the entire Salvadoran community, the country itself, has an interest in there being justice because nobody can be above the law. And then thirdly, all of humanity has an interest in justice or is understood to be a victim in this case because of the grave nature of the crimes. And so the prosecution of this case would set an international standard against targeting civilians and specifically children in the conduct of armed conflict. And in El Salvador, in 2020, the fact that the military makes this gesture saying that they will not submit themselves to civilian control is a pretty big indicator about how much is yet to go until we truly achieve democracy in El Salvador. And that's the history playing out in front of our faces on the newspapers. David is okay. He was present at the investigation or at the inspection site. He was accosted by a group of veterans who threatened him, but they're known people and they've been doing it to him for 10 years. It set off actually the threats against him set off an international reaction. Human Rights Watch, the United Nations, High Commission for Human Rights all sent warnings saying that human rights defenders should be respected and should not be attacked. So that's what's going down on this weekend. You should follow us on Twitter. It's a show, and it's kind of exciting.
So I hadn't heard about David, and I'm really grateful to know that he's okay. I also know David a little bit well enough to know that he probably took it with his chin up and just sort of tried to laugh it off. But I'm glad to know that David is all right, and know that Holy Communion is going to keep you all in our prayers as the next day goes forward. Mozote was picked as an emblematic case. And Noah, you talked a little bit about that, because the idea of Cristosal tries to take things that are emblematic, that sort of push the agenda of human rights, not just in the individual case, but sort of programmatically for the region along. And I wonder if we could talk about, and especially since we have Osvaldo with us, other ways that Cristosal is identifying right now and standing with victims and standing with folks strategically to try to, protect democracy and work to further the cause of human rights in the region. Are there other things that you would want us to know that you're working on right now?
So we are trying to apply these lessons from strategic litigation, from transitional justice, to different matters. A case and examples is a really important point in our agenda, working for defending LGBTIQ plus people in the region, in particular, when we're talking about hate crimes and discrimination in general. So we designed a new strategy for working with them and defending their rights. The main idea is to use a particular approach using legal actions, obviously, but at the same time, in parallel, using strategic communication, advocacy, and different forms and ways for changing reality. The main idea is not try to understand them or explain their situations, is give them spaces and empowering for using their own voices when defending their rights. We want them on the front line defending their rights. As you know, here in Central America, we are talking over different situations. We don't have legal support for the right of identity, for example. So trans people in general have not the access to healthcare, to education, or formal employment, So this is the general umbrella for discrimination. But also, we are helping in particular specific cases of hate crimes, because as you know, as a result of the cultural approach to the matter and the discrimination, the structural violence against them, you can find this general umbrella of hate and discrimination, but also, on the other hand, these particular extremely violent situations against them in impunity, without any consequence or accountability. And in some cases, we are talking about national or local authorities. It's not just a matter of other civil people, we are trying to innovate, be creative, and we are working with the LGBTIQ organizations in the region, applying this new approach, and we are hoping to have concrete results, changing realities from particular but also general measures and ideas.
I keep coming back to the ways in which this is a regional problem for North America and Central America, that, as you talk about questions of impunity, both in terms of violence towards the LGBTQ and especially the trans community, both for just folks who are, civilian actors committing hate crimes. Here in St. Louis, just a few weeks ago, we had another march for a trans woman who was killed by the police. There have been no charges. The name of the police officer who killed her in her home has not been released. There's been no movement toward justice. And so you talk about impunity. We know something of impunity. We're also talking on the day in which it was announced that 2 out of 3 of Breonna Taylor's killers, who were police officers, will face no charges. And the only charge that one of them will face will be something like reckless endangerment. And so there will be essentially no justice for Breonna Taylor, who was killed last spring, an African-American woman. And so we know something of impunity. And it's why when I listened about what's going on in Cristosal, it makes me, aware that we face the same issues in the United States. We tend to think about developing and developed countries, but in some sense, we're all trying to live in democracy and defend democracy these days. Cristosal is pretty, I don't want to say unique, but it puts you all on the edge because you're working so much with the LGBTQI community. Is that right?
I think what makes us different is that we are striving to be a more diverse organization ourselves, meaning that we're an organization where we look at, we have a diversity of indigenous people, we have participation of gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans people, we have North Americans, we're multicultural, and that is, I think, something that we bring, an added value that we bring to the struggle is that our own composition is a recognition that that vulnerable groups are not a subset of human rights. Their causes are interconnected to all causes of human rights. And I think just to tie it to the point you were making about democracy, we one of the reasons we decided to make the issue of impunity for these killings of trans people in the countries here a priority is that we see that while barbaric killings go on without any accountability, de facto, certain people and societies' lives don't matter, to use a word that's familiar to you all. And that means that we do not have a full democracy. There cannot be democracy in Central America, much less in the United States, where trans people can be killed with impunity, where they can be discriminated against and tortured and relegated. That means that we have still much to go towards consolidating democracy. And so I think the point linking it to Emosote, there's a term that we use, transitional democracy, which is a phase that's usually described that countries should go through after suffering armed conflict or massive violations of human rights in order to reestablish or establish for the first time democracy and peace. And so that's something that I think was intended to be applied to countries like El Salvador or Guatemala, who recently emerged from civil wars. But when those processes are not adequately addressed, as in the case of El Salvador and Guatemala, the human rights violations and the structures underneath them that permitted them to happen in impunity are still existing, then even 40 years later, it's necessary to continue the work towards transitional justice. In the United States, we have to look at the origins of slavery. We have to look at the killings and genocides of indigenous people and recognize that the United States is a transitional democracy. And until the underlying structures that permitted those atrocities against those populations are ended and violence is ended, we will not have fully emerged as a full democracy. So that's one of those things that ties the issues together.
The idea of applying that we are a developing democracy or a transitional democracy, or that we are in the midst of a transitional justice process to the United States, which tends to think of itself as, the city on the hill, the shining example. but I think it's only served a particular portion of folks. One of the things that I find really important about the regional strategy, and one of the questions that we're in the midst of here in our election cycle in the United States, comes around the decision to accompany victims. Cristosal did a report that looked at what happens when folks are returned to Central America. And it did narrative storytelling. It accompanied particular victims who were returned and asked them to explain why they had gone to the United States and what was happening when they were back. And I wonder if you can let us know sort of what is happening. What is Cristosal hearing from folks who are being returned to Guatemala, to El Salvador, to Honduras? What is that facing like as we hear about all these mass deportations and from an administration that wants to deport as many people and refuse as many asylum cases as possible? What happens when people return, and how is Cristosal accompanying those folks?
Sure. Look, as framework, you are talking about democracy and real peace, and these phenomena as processes, not as a goal and as accomplished goals. This general idea of impunity is not just about theory. We are used to think about impunity when seeing the numbers, the statistics about justice. What we learned in Central America is that impunity is about power, not only about the judiciary performance. So it's the way the power is used or is concentrated in some particular groups. Migration is the type of general and structural phenomenon with the capacity of explaining the situation in the region. This is the symptom, we can say, that invite us to trying to understand their situation in these countries. The lack of security, violence, the lack of education, healthcare, opportunities, employment, racism, and obviously the structural corruption and impunity. I was talking about impunity as a power factor, not only a judicial matter. So these are the causes for them when analyzing their future. So during these particular times, the pandemic, what we are witnessing in Central America is the fastest return, talking about deportees, and the cycle going faster than ever. And this speed is really unprecedented. We are building statistics. We are, interviewing deportees and returnees in Guatemala, but also we are going to start in the other countries. And we are knowing a lot about their situation. This first aspect, the speed of the cycle, but also their intention of returning, trying again to get to the US. And obviously, the COVID-19 situation. A lot of people infected or not knowing about their health situation, So in the same flight, you can find infected people with healthy people, but at the end of the day, under the risk of contagions. In general, we are really worried about the present situation, but also over the future, because we are waiting for a massive wave of migration, considering the really increasing situation on poverty, extreme poverty, malnutrition, and violence, because it's all part of the same framework when understanding these countries. So, recapping, we are witnessing a lot of migrants trying once and again to get the American soil, but also we are worrying for more.
We often hear about asylum claims that are denied in the United States. And we have a local, here in St. Louis, we have a local asylee who is somebody trying to make an asylum claim who's been resident for 5 years in a UCC church. And the Trump administration just went and raided a church in Maryland and sent somebody deported, like started deportation proceedings about somebody who was in a church. But so much of that question about asylum focuses on, you know, what is the threat when people are returned? Noah, if I could ask you, because it looks like Osvaldo has got not a great connection. What are we hearing about what happens when people are returned in these countries, and has that changed in recent months with COVID?
Yeah, there's an interesting change in that there's a new category of people coming back that are called expelled. People who are expelled from the United States, meaning that they passed no time at all in the United States. They got to the border, applied for asylum, and were sent to Mexico and deported back to one of the countries in Central America. And so that's a reflection of the closing of the international protection system of the United States, the closing off of it. And the consequences for that group of people are dire. In the Mesoamerican corridor, potentially millions of people who are not under the protection of any state, who find themselves ultimately in limbo. And that's a major failure of the international system. If we're worried about a breakdown of global systems or governance of nation states, we find the first indicators in the migrant population as we continue to fail them and do nothing really to stabilize the regions. The consequences of unaddressed humanitarian need are always, sooner or later, te le vamos a pasar la factura. We'll always, the bill will come home. We'll send the bill. It's always better to protect rights, safeguard lives in the short and the long run. The political decision not to do that is usually on the basis of the power dynamics that Osvaldo was talking about.
And for a while, the conditions that people were placed in when they were returned, especially to El Salvador, was reprehensible, right?
And they created what were called containment centers. Ultimately, 12,000 Salvadorans, either at the border or on the streets, were picked up by soldiers and put into containment centers that were improvised, basically holding facilities, most of them without adequate hygienic or even food situations. And Cristosal had an important role in bringing an end to that practice through litigation. We representing like 150 people some of them were returnees, deported people. We presented habeas corpus cases to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in our favor and broadened their ruling to say what powers the president had to detain people in the context of the COVID emergency. And ironically, like I just said, violating human rights usually causes more expenses. And these containment centers literally cost billions of dollars. And I don't know if billions, but the government did spend $2.6 billion in 6 months. We don't know where that is. And also became centers of infection. So it is always better to respect rights, to act transparently, even in the moments of emergencies. Just to say one last thing you mentioned about deportees, more Central Americans have been deported during the global health pandemic than any other region of the world. It's about 60, 70,000 people were sent back to their countries with limited health protocols, procedures in place, and found themselves trying to reintegrate in societies that were in lockdown, and found themselves in a situation of hunger. And what we find now, and Osvaldo can speak to this more in depth, but in Guatemala, for example, the majority of the migrants come from the Guatemala's high plateau, which is one of the primarily indigenous regions of the country. And our colleagues doing the monitoring are shocked at the levels of poverty that they're finding among indigenous people in Guatemala. And I think that's something that's worth reflecting on, is that the original nations of this continent, our Mayan brothers and sisters, are still the poorest. They're still treated as if they were second-class human beings. How is that possible? We should all be wondering.
This is a tough day, I think, in the States, and it's been a tough week with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and with the decision around Breonna Taylor, and just sort of all we're hearing, and to hear today, essentially, as we're seeing governments in our region, both in the United States and in Central America, are using COVID as an excuse for further violations of human rights. Our government is deporting people and not treating people well in detention centers. And COVID sort of keeps people's attention elsewhere. But I wonder about that idea of transitional democracy. As we face these moments and we don't know what the election here is going to bring, what the future political situation is going to be in the Central American countries, how can transitional democracy, how does a commitment to human rights work and the lens of human rights help you continue to be able to move when democracy seems to be transitioning in the wrong direction?
Like you bring our personal relationship into most of these conversations, but when we were little chickens, first in El Salvador, getting to know the world, at least I think I had the idea that what was asked of our generation was the continuation of the broadening of rights, that arc of the moral universe that Martin Luther King talked about. That we were continuing to build on a legacy of certain conquests of rights, and we would see in our lifetime an expansion. And it actually turns out we're going to have to fight tooth and nail just to hold on to the minimum standards. That's the reality that our generation has to stand up and assume. And so, what does it mean to defend rights in a moment of democratic setbacks? It's a question we asked ourselves. What does it mean to defend rights and democracy in the middle of a global health pandemic? And the thing is that human rights, the authoritarians and others, aspiring authoritarians, say that things like democracy, things like rights, are obstacles for me to be able to guarantee the security of everybody, right? That's where that people who are trying to detract from the expansion of rights to people sell a narrative that says that, this is an extraordinary moment and I need extraordinary powers in order to be able to guarantee you security. That means that we can't talk about rights, that rights are an obstacle, they're a speed bump. And in reality, human rights, as they were proposed by the World War II generation in the Universal Declaration, are not obstacles. They are the pathway to response. They offer a way, or just to make it shorter, putting human dignity and rights at the front of all of our actions is a way to respond to emergency and to transform the underlying causes that make those emergencies so acute in vulnerable populations. And so as democracy is in a crisis, it is the very standards and human rights themselves that I think enter or offer us a pathway towards strengthening. Scott, it's about keeping the faith.
Yeah, keeping the faith, as the presiding bishop would say.
I think that the next step, and this is our inspiration in Cristosal, is justice. We have to work on justice, access to justice, accountability, We have to build this really strong rule of law. This lack of equality and this lack of real rule of law is generating the uncertainty and the weakening of our democracy. and the end of the day. And it's really sad during 21st century, still witnessing authoritarianism, tyrants, and violence from government, and we thought that was an ended period in our evolution, but it's not. Yeah. So it's a day-by-day commitment.
Every time I engage with Cristosal, I find the nimbleness, to use a very, sort of buzz North American word, but the nimbleness of the organization to be so inspiring. I was down there a couple of years ago now, but when the Mozote case was advancing and the lawyers from Cristosal weren't in the courtroom, but they were at the Legislative Assembly with Mozote victims. And it wasn't just the attorneys, it was the communications staff of Cristosal, because simultaneously they were working a legislative agenda, a judicial agenda, and a communication strategy to try to help the whole of El Salvador come along to this idea that justice for the victims is central to how we take our next steps together. And it's a critical phase. And that also created political pressure to keep the process going. I find that kind of the work that Cristosal is done on Mozote and that they are using in those strategic cases so inspiring and frankly daunting for those of us in the United States who say we care about justice. There's several strategies that we got to build together to keep up with the little bit of what Cristosal does. So October 8th, there is a 20th anniversary for Cristosal. Noah, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, obviously we would have preferred to do something in person, but we're gonna do this online. And it's we're celebrating 20 years since our founding, which for us is a huge milestone, and also trying to celebrate a little bit, the leadership and responsibility that we've kind of taken on. But the event is not going to be boring. Right? That's my goal. It will not be boring. We have a sort of famous, like a Tiny Desk concert, NPR famous artist called Gina Chavez, who's connected to El Salvador. She's a singer-songwriter, and she's going to be our Maestro de Ceremonios, our host. And we have a famous poet, Karen Forche, who just wrote a book about El Salvador. Will be reciting some of her poetry, as well as one of her proteges, who's a Salvadoran American, who will recite some of his poetry. We have the Guatemalan National Choir will be joining us. We have a puppet show that the church in New York will be doing to explain.
I'm really looking forward to that puppet show. Yeah.
So don't expect us just to be talking at you about human rights all night. It's a celebration. It's a virtual one, but you can drink at home and dance to the music and laugh at the puppet show and enjoy the poetry. That's the goal. We have a couple very generous longtime supporters who have given us a matching grant. And I think at this point it's about $50,000. So if we can raise $50,000 around this event, we will walk away with $100,000, which will be a real achievement in a difficult year for us. But we also know there are a lot of people who care about Cristosal deeply and our mission, and this is a special year for us. So if you can join us, we'd love to have you. And if the donation is not a possibility, just come and enjoy the show, because I think it'll be good.
I'm really looking forward. I heard a rumor that there's going to be an address by the presiding bishop potentially too, and he's always a big ticket getter. So we're excited about that, and we'll get more of a chance. I'm looking forward to some of the produced segments. There's going to be great snapshot videos about the work that Cristosal is doing, so that we can get little pieces of it in between the entertainment. I'm really looking forward to it. Noah, Osvaldo, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for the work that you continue to do. We look forward to hearing from you more on October 8th. But really, really thank you for taking the time to update us about what's going on with Cristosal.
Thank you, and sorry for my connections problems, you know.
It's the
It's
nature
beyond
of
my
these things.
control, you know.
Yeah.
Thank you for the time. It was a pleasure.